You're listening to Stories Written and Read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along with me as I read this story, you can find a link to that in the description of this video. You can also find stories regularly updated at the link of that same blog, and as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. You're listening to Roommates. The sky was overcast, and seemed all the more so for it having been clear and sunny 2 days ago. She had taken all her things inside from the balcony, fearing it might rain, and hoping it would too, so that she could wait to put her things back out until the rain was done. The rain was steady now. She was waiting for it to let up and become more of a trickle. Without warning from any weather service, the rain had come unexpectedly, though the dark clouds should have been warning enough. She hoped to be as surprised by how it would look when the rain stopped as she had been by its arrival. Maybe there would be sun again, and the light would look eerie coming through the air, purified by the rain and heavy with moisture. Her thoughts in this direction began with the plants she had taken inside, and extended to those growing at the side of the nearby roads, and those that grew in larger numbers further afield. Returning home now, her thoughts turned to the shrubs and flower bunches, those the landscapers and gardeners cared for, that livened up the complex to which her apartment belonged. She liked to see the landscapers and gardeners work, and half believed, but only half, that she would have liked to work as they did. Thinking of all those plants now, except her own, she wondered how each was managing to withstand the rain, whether the flowers that grew by the roadside and in the field were faring better than those the landscapers tended, or whether there was no difference, and they took the rain equally well, each bound before it as they were able. The rain had happened, she explained, when she had seen Lucy observing her as she moved her things inside, first gradually and then suddenly. It crept up on me, she said, with a faint smile and a small shrug, attempting by saying this to defy the gloom she felt the weather was forcing on them. Lucy gave a knowing nod, at which Melanie turned back to her work, trying to finish it quickly, not wanting to let the window stand open for too long and cool out the apartment. The wind wasn't strong enough to tear the leaves from the trees, nor was the weather cold enough to accomplish this with less force. As drastic as the change was to her, it would take a greater upheaval for that. Nor was it time for the leaves to change color. That was a season away. She needn't have bothered bringing her garden inside, but she didn't think of that, and had she thought of it, she'd have thought it better to be safe regardless. The rain fell straight and fell too fast to be slanted by the wind. The sky was dark, gray where it wasn't black, and seemed to have drawn up into itself. You could hardly see the rain until it dropped suddenly into view, where it then had time only to fall a bit further before hitting the ground. Of all the blessings she had, the one she had grown most accustomed to was where she lived. It was quiet. It lay where the road that ran beside it curved, making cars stop a moment to check for oncoming traffic before turning onto the next road. Some of the rain, because of this incline, ran clear down into the gutters, taking on the black color of the street as it did so. Some of the water pooled together and milled about on the street, as if waiting for gravity and the incline that led to the gutters to tell it where to go. Out of that mass of water came little rivers, and from them wavelets formed as the rain hit the water sloshing in the street. The rain made circles in the puddles as it fell. As the rain began to come down harder and faster, what circles it might make with one raindrop were too soon destroyed by the next to be seen. So too did the rain that began by dripping down the leaves of the trees start to come down with a force that distorted the effect it had had before and turned them into little waterfalls. Soon there was hardly any difference between the rain that fell from the leaves and that which fell straight to the ground with nothing to break its fall. A few people had been caught out by the rain. They went for cover, their wet clothes sticking to them fast, too tight on their skins for the wind to take a firm hold. The wet leaves stuck to the street too. Some people, under cover and not, were visibly weighing their options, taking small tentative steps forward and back, their movements too small to force a decision. For those with flat shoes, the water went up to their toes. She had been caught out too, but indoors, and again she congratulated herself on having found this apartment. It cost half of what she'd pay in the city proper. Her commute was a quarter hour in good conditions, a half hour or less in bad. She looked at the people cowering under the roofs of storefronts and the balconies of houses, and tried to guess where they came from and how far they had to go before they got home. Looking to where her plants had stood, she thought, as she sometimes did, that she might like a garden, a wish that needed for its fulfillment more space for herself and for her plants. What space she had, she used well. There wasn't much to be won by trying to reorganize and use what was left even better. She simply had to have more. Else, where would space for this new garden of hers come from in this apartment? She looked over her shoulder to see if Lucy was there. Seeing that she wasn't, she turned back to the window. She wanted to turn the lights on. They were on, but they seemed to be having trouble lighting up the room, and that, despite the fact that when she and Lucy sometimes fell into a conversation in the evening, it was never so dark as it was now. She asked herself if there might be something wrong with the light bulbs. Eventually, her eyes adjusted to the darkness of the evening, and then to that of the night. The room seemed darker, she figured, because she expected light from the window and wasn't getting it. It didn't bother her on other days when it would get late and she and Lucy would find each other somehow, start to talk, and if they gathered around the living room table that stood in the space between their rooms, they would start to sit closer together, sometimes to the point of leaning towards each other too. The living room's darkness didn't bother her then because her attention was elsewhere. The dark came very early then. It came early when you weren't watching it. The lights came on in the places you could see through the living room window opposite their apartment. As the night filled out the windows, the figures the windows reflected became fuller, richer, and better defined. What was outside lost its color, and what was inside seemed somehow to gain that color in equal measure to what the outside lost. The faces that the windows reflected would by that time have become ruddier, flushed with color. The closer they were, the less the darkness mattered to them. When it got late and they got to talking, Lucy would feel it was time to drink. She would bring out a bottle of wine, which she seemed never to have to open for the first time, at least not when Melanie was there. The slight thud the bottle made as Lucy set it on the table suggested, depending on how Melanie took it that day, that she had had some wine beforehand, or more innocently, that she was eager to get started. The glasses Lucy used always fit the drink, at least approximately. If necessary, she would wash them herself and bear Melanie's amused protests without a word. Melanie might say, as Lucy's washing continued unabated, that she was making a fuss over nothing, but when the washing was done, Melanie happily took her glass off Lucy's hand. Doing so, she might say if questioned, only because Lucy was handing it to her, and it would be unbearably rude to refuse the glass to keep her word. This insistence on propriety and standards was something Lucy stuck with because it felt right, and something Melanie went along with. Melanie knew wine could develop when allowed to breathe, but beer and cocktails were, to the best of her knowledge, unchanged by their containers. It made her laugh to see Lucy grip the neck and bottom of a bottle as she poured the wine, her thin white hands and her long nails making little claws at each of the bottle's ends. Lucy didn't mind being the only one of them to buy wine. They had come to an understanding of sorts. The wine was a gift Lucy could easily afford, so what did it matter if it was never repaid? That the wine was cheap posed something of a problem to them. Cheap wine had to be drunk quickly. It had to be gotten down before the senses rejected it, and yet the point wasn't they agreed to get drunk. Left in the apartment for a sufficiently long time, the wine would find someone to drink it, and Lucy wanted that someone not to be a stranger. She preferred it to be herself and someone she knew. The people Lucy brought in, Friends, co-workers, and acquaintances, the third person in their get-togethers, or the fourth or the fifth, they remained strangers, at least to Melanie. She never saw them again. If she did, she didn't remember. She didn't care to. Drinking in these evenings was secondary to all else they did. Neither drank heavily, and neither knew much about drinking besides their own tastes. When, for variety, they did drink something stronger than wine, they went at it slowly, and sometimes took further precautions by watering down their drinks. By watering it down. They were determined to remain sensible. They felt they shouldn't do this with wine. It would be wrong to water down wine in a way watering down a stronger drink wouldn't be. As a compromise in such situations, they kept water on hand. It was a good system, Melanie reflected. They went at it in moderation and were treated gently in return, no regrets to worry about or hangovers to endure. There was no need to punish themselves further by forcing down home remedies that hurt and revolted those that used them, if they did anything, more than they helped. Lemon juice, Melanie said one night as they were discussing the subject. Lucy laughed in surprise, her mouth wide, her body lurching forward in a way that made Melanie worry for the safety of their glasses. When Lucy had recovered, she asked how it was supposed to work. Melanie couldn't say. She invented something about the acids in the lemon juice, supposing that they might counteract the alcohol somehow, and added that at least the juice would help to cover your breath. She gave a smile that cemented her uncertainty. Though drinking was secondary, there were times when they faltered. Their words stopped coming so quickly, and they lapsed into silence. The frequency of these evenings averaged out to 3 or 4 a month, and it could go on for hours at a time because drinking didn't take center stage. As the night wore on, their drinking would have its intended effect. It got them to talk, it made them animated, it made them not care too much about what they and the others said, and in spite of that carelessness, it made them stay seated. More than that, it rooted them to their places with a firmness no beginner could have expected to come from a few drinks. Their conversations were grounded too. When drinking, and even at the next stage, when not quite drunk, they felt no need to reveal themselves to be other than what they were sober. Melanie was proud of her memory. She liked to show she cared for someone by remembering things about them, and made sure to greet people by name. There were few people who knew her and had a bad opinion of her. Her care for her reputation, which she thought of as politeness, reined her in when she felt like answering a stupid or careless remark with one of her own. She made an effort, especially in the first months of having moved in, to introduce herself to the others in the apartment block, wanting to get to know her neighbors and make a good first impression. Whoever she became close with, and however many people that would show itself in time. When she and a neighbor had made their introductions, and had come to know each other by sight and name, if not better than that, she could greet them with more warmth and less anxiety about what they thought about her, not any more in the manner of one stranger to another. If she crossed paths now with someone who lived at the complex, she asked Lucy to guess who she had ran into while coming up the stairs. Lucy always forfeited her chance to guess and asked who it was. Last week it was Ruth, and when Melanie said so, Lucy wondered if there hadn't been a mistake, if Melanie had confused a non-existent Ruth with whoever she had seen. Then Lucy, her uncertainty growing, wondered whose mistake it really was. Having said this, Melanie waited for Lucy to admit she didn't know who Ruth was, and though Melanie hid her pride well, she invariably felt it swell up inside her. The look of confusion and self-searching she saw pass over Lucy's face finally resolved into resignation. Whoever Ruth was, whatever she might look like, that Lucy decided was beyond her. Melanie tried to remind her of Ruth, eventually settling triumphantly, believing it would do the trick, on her pinched nose as the detail that would bring her to mind. She pinched her fingers around her own nose to show Lucy how Ruth looked. Her imitation drew a blank stare. Disappointed, she gave Lucy some advice. Think of that nose, and you'll know it the next time you see her. On the rare occasions that Melanie had to greet someone impersonally, she would try, once back in their apartment, to remember the person's name, casting about when her first efforts failed her for details of character and appearance to bring them to mind. Finally, in desperation, she would go to Lucy, saying something like this: "You'll never guess who I saw on the stairs, and I know you won't because I don't know either." Lucy was little help, but she took Melanie's retelling these stories in good humor. To Melanie's question if she'd seen Ruth yet came Lucy's prompt reply: "I wouldn't know it if I had." From the day she moved in, Melanie had tried her best, as she still did now, to get along with Lucy as she did with her other neighbors. Fastidious in everything that could be expected of her as a roommate, she had reached, with more strain, about the same standard to which Lucy held herself. In return, Lucy tended to her plants when they seemed to need it, going as far as she thought her experience allowed. Having set herself certain standards, and kept to them with care, Melanie could now begin to relax somewhat. She had made her first impression, and she and Lucy got along well. She no longer had to jolt herself into action, or rein herself in with the thought of what might happen to her reputation if she didn't. When having a balcony was still new to her, which it wasn't to Lucy, who had lived in a house with a balcony ever since she cared to remember, Melanie mentioned her dream of having a garden, and showed Lucy the potted plants she had brought to make the balcony the best garden it could be. Different in species though they were, the plants in her garden could all take a day's neglect without looking tired, and not one of them produced anything but flowers and seeds. It was this last point that Lucy took up in conversation. After watching Melanie go about her watering for a few days, Lucy worked up the nerve to ask if she ever planned to grow something useful. Melanie asked what she meant by that. "Something you can eat," she explained. "Fruits or vegetables or something. I mean, it's nice to look at." Here she trailed off. To her, it seemed Melanie was putting enough work in to expect to get something out of it. "But I do get something out of it. I do. I don't need any more than that," Melanie said, as if it was all the same to her whether Lucy understood. Lucy realized that she had been too forward when making her suggestion, had not put it as a suggestion in fact, but as a command phrased as a question. She took her mistake harder than Melanie had taken her rudeness, the difference owing something to how Lucy would have felt had someone spoken to her like that, and her belief that Melanie felt the same way. Having raised her point badly, she let it drop from her mind. It was Melanie's garden, she decided, to do with as she wished. She said something of the sort to Melanie to apologize, speaking a little quicker than usual to get it over with before her nerves ran out or she changed her mind. She resented herself for her guilt and resented Melanie a little as well for making her feel guilty. Melanie had nearly forgotten what had happened and didn't know how much more strongly Lucy felt about it, going from one extreme to another than she did. Though unaware of how troubled Lucy had been by it, Melanie had felt a strange comfort at not being the only one of them to have made such mistakes, and given herself reason to worry. While she would likely think of the incident only if it was spoken of directly, the feeling it had given her returned whenever Lucy made mistakes. To know that she had forgotten someone's name made Melanie feel better by comparison, superior in one regard, however meaningless it was to Lucy. Neither of them thought much or very deeply about these things. They didn't have the time, and when they did, such as during their evenings together, they showed little inclination for it. When they started getting drunk, or getting nearer to it than usual, they didn't also start getting introspective. If a change took place, they went in the opposite direction. They stayed grounded, anyway, relative to how others acted when they drank. What they talked about drunk was pretty much what they talked about sober. What they had done, what they were doing, what they had to or wanted to do, and this was as far as their interests went. Still, drinking made them better at some things than they were otherwise, able to laugh at what wasn't funny, and nod knowingly, encouragingly, at what they didn't understand and shouldn't encourage if they did. As they talked, they had flashes of what seemed to be brilliance, which came and went too quickly to be remembered, much less understood in the present. The words came out haphazardly, too close together for them to know what they were saying, or how close it was to what they were trying to say. or how close it was to what they wanted to say. Some of it verged on coherence. They knew it, and this excited them. Then they lost it and stopped making sense. Their way of thinking was a forgetful single-mindedness. They relentlessly pursued the current object of their attention until the next came into view, and the one before faded from sight. They forgot that they had forgotten, and so they were free to keep talking. Their thoughts evaporated before they could be fully expressed, and then maybe there was a flash of what seemed to be brilliance, which came and went too quickly for them to grasp it firmly and keep it with them. What came out, if anything did, was garbled, and Lucy and Melanie knew it, though they didn't care to correct themselves and try to retain whatever insight had come upon them. When they had talked themselves out, they tended to drift off and stare listlessly into space. Arms on the armrests, they assumed a manner of languid repose, sinking, when a spell of inspiration was over, into their wicker chairs, and allowing the pause in their conversation to grow longer and longer. Warmed by their drinking, they opened a window for fresh air and for how pleasant it was to suddenly feel a cool breeze. They watched as flies came in, curious, lured by the light of the kitchen, and then they watched as they each tried to bat them down. There was no danger of the flies staying anyway, whether they swatted them or not. They could get up, shakily, pushing themselves to their unsteady feet, with one hand on the table. And go back to their rooms if they felt up to it, if they thought that was better than to remain where they were and to fall asleep at the table. There they would cradle their heads in their arms or use the crook of their elbows as pillows, and everything that had come to them during the night, all that would be gone by morning. It would know instinctively when it was time to go. When they awoke, the first thing they saw was the now room temperature wine to their heads. That was what stayed. Even leaving the window open, they were safe from a chill, except when it was winter. Then, too, she brought her plants inside. Last winter, she and Lucy had been drinking, and Lucy had asked her for the name of one of her flowers, her attention drawn to the rows of potted plants standing at the threshold of the balcony. Melanie listed off the names to most of them, and when their names were out of reach, she tried to derive them from their appearances as an aid to her memory. She didn't pretend not to guess. Marigold was simple. The white flower that Lucy pointed to next was much harder to place. After some quiet concentration, Melanie clapped her hands as she hit upon the name. Wandering Jew, she said. I knew it. They continued their game and drank in between, their movements becoming sluggish and imprecise, and increasingly so. Weary and happy, they smiled at nothing, their smiles broken from time to time by directionless laughter. Drinking made them drowsy, and there was nothing outside the apartment that could interest them in that state, not enough to overcome that drowsiness. Everything they wanted was in arm's reach. There was no one to tell them it was time to go, and nowhere they had to leave. As if through some comparable instinct of caution, they always cleared the living room table before they began to drink. They would put things there over the course of the week, temporarily, they would say to themselves, and forget about them, treating the table as an extension of the desks and drawers in their rooms. At the end of the week, or however long it took, they would see how messy the table had become and clear it. When one of them started, the other soon grasped what was going on and jumped to help. It didn't happen all at once, but it happened just the same by a series of small movements. Lucy would get the wine bottles and chairs. If they weren't there, Melanie would go through their belongings, taking them one by one back to where they belonged, asking Lucy if something was hers when she was unsure. Melanie retained this tendency of staring off at nothing when she was sober. Some, like Lucy's visitors, who saw this look of hers without understanding it, said she was dour. Others, who saw her and felt a momentary pity for her, disagreed. They claimed to know she wasn't normally like that, and she was really trying to control herself in some extraordinary circumstance. Death in the family, some said idly, or illness. Had she been asked to describe it, she would have said it was like following her thoughts off a cliff and into nothingness. This happened most often when she was stressed, as she was after a week of work, and she came home to begin attending to her half of the chores. They hadn't laid down what these chores were and who was responsible for them. They didn't have to. They saw by the state of the apartment what had been done and what was left. So it came that today she unloaded and reloaded the dishwasher, and having done that, began attending to the apartment's remaining needs, getting them out of the way so that things would be in order for their evening. When she was between these tasks, she occasionally felt fatigued and had to stop. Bracing herself with her hands on her hips, she would sigh and draw deep breaths until the feeling passed. She had thought about it and worked out a theory that sounded right. When she had too much on her mind, or nothing at all, nothing to set or to keep her thoughts in motion, they slowed down and then stopped entirely. So did she, but she was able in a moment to bring herself to life again. When asked at those times what she was thinking about, she would reflexively say it was nothing in particular, which it sometimes was. It certainly felt like it, even when it was something. A slight bend in the neck and eyes cast downward was a natural position in times like these. Sometimes Lucy drank with the strangers she brought in. Sometimes she didn't. No matter what explanation Melanie gave for this, or rule she tried to tease out, none of them held up to scrutiny. She learned to accept the appearance of these strangers at their table with an openness that, depending on the guest, could develop into a pleasant surprise. She loved those that were interesting and tolerated those that were boring. That was the chance you took with things like these. She didn't think back to any particular person or any one night she had spent with them or with Lucy alone. There was no substance in it. She knew that, even when she was enjoying herself. It was like, she had thought one evening, trying to string the words together, it was like how Lucy enjoyed her garden, clueless about the plants' names and what Melanie really saw in them. Melanie didn't know what Lucy saw in her strangers, what she was missing, and if there was something for her to miss. She could only guess. That was between Lucy and her guests, something she couldn't ask about. It would be true to say Lucy's guests left no impression on her, and equally true to say they left many impressions on her, which she, however, could not keep apart, and so most of what could be said of them blended together. They brought to mind the fact that people could have such features as those she saw in them. They did no more than that. She had little idea of them as individuals, regardless of how much or little of an impression they made. Evening was no time for people to be making impressions on her anyway. Last week's guest, a man who looked like an overgrown boy, had asked Melanie for something to light his cigarette. This was after he'd fished out the pack of cigarettes he'd jammed into his pants pocket, making his question and the need from which it came more pointed. He opened the window to be thoughtful towards his host, and as a practical consideration. Melanie, irritated nevertheless, said she didn't think they had a light. He asked her to check, and she came back with a candle lighter. He put a cigarette in his mouth and came closer so she could light it. Rather than walk the few steps between them, he bent his head down and leaned out towards her to bring his cigarette to the lighter. She lit it, and he nodded in appreciation. Then he laughed, took a drag on his cigarette, and laughed again, harder. The cigarette would have fallen out of his mouth the second time, if not for his having the presence of mind to hold on to it with his lips. She became stern and hard-faced. For her, this was a tense moment, one she was glad to leave behind as soon as it had passed. Later that evening, as she gave it more thought, she understood what had happened and her sternness returned. He had taken it as a joke, but it was as one he was happy to be a part of, not like she had intended. She took to people slowly. She was not timid. It was a selectiveness about whom she let into her life. It was at times like these that she had to wonder where Lucy got these people from. She knew she'd have the answer, or a good guess, if she thought about it a bit longer, or turned to Lucy and asked her, but she wasn't willing to do that. She wanted him out, and learning his reasons for coming would only delay his going. Rather than ask for an ashtray, he put his arm out the window and gave his cigarette a firm shake. The breeze took care of the smoke and some of the smell. The window overlooked a hedgerow, and the hedgerow was surrounded by grass. She said nothing and feared the worst. Looking out at the ashes as they fell, momentarily bright and then invisible in the darkness, she made note of the spot where they landed, intending to check it later when he had gone to see what sort of a mess he had made. Any grass he had burned, it now occurred to her, must have grown back in the time since then. The rain prevented her from being certain about this, and from seeing whether the ashes had in fact landed on the grass, as she thought, or on the walkways beside it. Undeterred, she craned her neck and looked out the window, standing where the man had stood then to dispose of his ashes. She saw how the rain had darkened the walkways, but if either they or the grass was damaged, she couldn't see it. Facing the open window, his elbows on the windowsill, the man smoked his cigarette until it was gone. Then he sat down at the table with them and took small, polite sips from the wine-glass Lucy got for him. He had his shoulders drawn inward, and from this Melanie reasoned he was shrinking back from his earlier bravado. Try as she might for the rest of the evening, motivated by a dislike whose depth surprised even her, she found nothing for her to pin on him or to throw in his face the next time he came. There was to be no next time. He didn't come again. Her plans for revenge fell apart even as she was plotting. His crimes against her, she realized, were too flimsy to hold up for days after the fact. She would have looked ridiculous trying to embarrass him by reminding him of what he had done. He could laugh it off, and to onlookers she would sound unhinged, which would further enrage her. He could deny it, and she would sound like she was making it up. That too would further enrage her. For the rest of the night that she could now remember, she had her hand closed tight and a fist around her glass, as if holding on to it for support, and for restraint too, to keep herself out of trouble. Some time later the man left. He must have, or he disappeared, or he found somewhere better to be. If it was the last of the three, he was selective about the company he chose. Like herself, she admitted, though he'd had somewhere to go, somewhere to leave, and she hadn't. She tried to remember what Lucy had been doing then, and found that she had by that point dropped out of the picture altogether. She had evidently been so overshadowed by what was going on around her that, like so many of her guests, but not all of them as Melanie was coming to find, there wasn't much of her to be remembered. When Lucy told that story about the lighter in the weeks thereafter, she had a gleam in her eyes that was only half from drinking. From what Melanie had heard her say to the people she brought around for an audience, Lucy remembered what Melanie had done better than she did herself. You should have seen it, Lucy would say, her enthusiasm driving her to illustrate what had happened, to show them the lighter and Melanie had used and the window the man had shook his cigarette from. What became of the man, none of them ever asked. Lucy didn't say. It was his coarseness, Melanie now decided, his quickness to show how he felt, and to act on it too, and his unwillingness to hide it. And yet maybe because of that same need to act, he wasn't without a conscience. He had noticed her irritation at being asked for a light, and had tried, by opening the window, to make good on it. In precisely this way, her impression of him came first, and the explanation followed at a considerable distance. Melanie grew forgetful after she had had any more than a few glasses, and would then point to the furniture that littered the apartment to ask who it belonged to. She didn't, as it may appear, need to be drunk to ask that question. She wasn't drunk the first time she asked it, anyway. The answer she got from Lucy wasn't important enough for her to keep it with her permanently. The next time Melanie asked, she might feel without understanding where the feeling came from. That they had spoken about it before. Some of what she pointed to belonged to their landlady, and some of it was theirs, Lucy's or her own. Lucy said their apartment looked like the storage space of a pawnshop because of this. Nevertheless, it fit so well together, the wicker chairs and the tables Miss Morrison had put in, and the rest that Melanie and Lucy had bought, that Melanie could forget Lucy's answer and begin to wonder which of the three of them had arranged it that way. This would lead them to another subject, one their conversation seemed to continually find their way back to. Was it furnished on the whole as a place their landlady would like to live in, or at least according to some plan, or was it more likely, as Melanie contended, that it was assembled from whatever Miss Morrison had at hand? Sometimes people left furniture behind, good usable furniture, and sold it to Miss Morrison, or gave it up for free to have it off their hands. These were things their owners had fallen out of love with, and which they had let fall out of use, things that they kept because keeping was, for a time, easier than freeing themselves of what had become dead weight. Miss Morrison could have had an easier time of it had she simply given the things away, and she had considered doing so. What she bought from one tenant, she sold within a month to another for a small profit. She took this profit as recompense for being the middlewoman and putting the business together. She paid more than her tenants expected to get. She paid more than her tenants expected and sold it nearly always for what, when she bought it, she expected it would fetch. She got the idea from a tenant leaving a drawer in his room or a chair. The exact item could change with each telling of the story. Not knowing what to do with it, like the tenant himself, and not having the option of packing her things and leaving the question for someone else to answer, she asked the people who were still in the tenant's. She asked the people who were still in the former tenant's apartment, and found the answer there. If this could be done for one tenant, Miss Morrison had thought, why not for more, and why shouldn't she help move things along? She owed much of the surrounding complex and felt responsible for it. Though she had hired a maintenance crew to attend to menial work, she involved herself in the lives of her tenants by offering them this convenience and by dreaming up others. Miss Morrison had thought about expanding this pawnshop operation to other areas of her tenants' lives, had considered which areas those might be, but found nothing suitable. Another of her ideas was to set up the hedgerow by the complex and improve the soil that had not been used before and gone without such additions. The plot the hedge grew on wasn't a path, not leading anywhere it could never have been one. The hedgerow then divided the complex, if only marginally and not in any practical sense, from the roads that ran beside it, so around it and past it. This in-house pawn shop of sorts was the reason for the notices that went around when someone had something to sell, especially something that could be moved from one apartment to another, from floor to floor with the elevator, from room to room, and otherwise with the assistance of any residents who, seeing people struggling to move something, felt obliged to help. Lucy and Melanie tried to do their part too, though they usually made more noise and took up more space around what they were trying to lift than they actually helped. Still, Melanie said it was good to be seen lending a hand. Lucy, for her part, couldn't say she was wrong, and joined in when Melanie did. The pawn shop was how Melanie and Lucy had come into some of the things in their apartment. They couldn't always tell apart the items they had bought from what Miss Morrison herself owned and had furnished the apartments of the complex with. Every so often, Miss Morrison came through to make a sweep of the grounds, and see with her own eyes that everything was being attended to. It was on one of these trips that Melanie saw Miss Morrison outside their apartment talking to some other landlord. She had a naturally loud voice that carried her words all the way to their balcony. It was, in Melanie's view, and in Lucy's as well, not eavesdropping if you heard someone without meaning to, without having to try to hear them. She was especially loud when beginning a subject, and when ending one too. It was the same with beginning and ending conversations. She brought at both times the full force of her voice to bear upon those she talked to show how pleased she was to meet them, and then how sad she was to say goodbye. It was when Miss Morrison continued to talk, and losing steam quieted down, that Melanie had to try hard to make out what they were saying. It was It was then that she felt she had intruded. Though she kept her eyes forward and couldn't have been caught out or even suspected by anyone but herself. Miss Morrison broke abruptly from her conversation and looked up at the balcony at Melanie, who was sitting there. Melanie sitting on the balcony. Melanie felt caught in her intrusion and regretted having watered her plants before Miss Morrison came. That would have made for a good excuse to be out here, she thought. Are those yours? Miss Morrison asked. What's that one called? She said, pointing at some spot on the balcony. Speaking to someone new, Miss Morrison's voice had fresh purpose that restored it to its former volume. The distance that separated them made it hard to tell what she was pointing to. Melanie swept a hand over the plants near her to figure out which Miss Morrison meant. She went from one to the other until she reached the peonies. Then there came a cry from below. That one, the pink ones. Oh, those, Melanie said in surprise, not having thought them especially remarkable. Those are peonies, she said. Oh, peonies, came the reply. Yes. There was a pause. I forget the names too sometimes, Melanie said. They talked about her plants and how often she watered them, how nice it was that her apartment, unlike others, had a balcony. This came from Miss Morrison, and her wish for a garden. But you've got one, Miss Morrison said flatly, her tone between a statement of fact and a question, motioning towards the balcony with her outstretched hand, as if Melanie didn't know what she was standing on. Here, too, Melanie took Miss Morrison's meaning more from her words than anything else, her outstretched hand and the motions she made with it being indistinct at this distance. Faced with this impasse in the conversation, and not wanting to offend her landlady, Melanie changed the subject. Seeing the clouds gathering above them with a dark foreboding look, an omen that in the hours that followed she came to learn would go unfulfilled, she said she would likely have to take her plants inside. Melanie gestured in explanation of what she said to the clouds by the same instinct that had made Miss Morrison make her own gestures. Miss Morrison looked around her and saw it too. She then began to extricate herself from the conversation as quickly and politely as possible, making her exit by getting Melanie to promise to take good care of her plants, especially the peonies. Oh, but I know you will. They look wonderful, she said, before Melanie could answer, speaking to Melanie and to herself. Melanie found this way of speaking curious, and lacking an answer, was taken aback, though not unhappy that Miss Morrison chose this as her cue to break off their conversation. Hearing about this episode from Melanie later that day, Lucy thought that Miss Morrison must live near the property. She proposed the idea to Melanie, who went along with it because she had no way to dispute it. Mrs. Morrison looked for the same plant on next year's visit, and seeing that it wasn't where it had been, didn't ask Melanie what had happened to it. She could see neither Melanie nor Lucy and continued going about her business, not altogether put out that this detour of hers had come to nothing. They did not see her often. Lucy once claimed to never have seen her, a claim she revised to be that she had never spoken to her face to face. She didn't mean for either statement to be taken literally. They were true in spirit, meant to illustrate that Lucy didn't know Miss Morrison beyond what she heard second-hand from Melanie and others. To them, Miss Morrison was a simple character, the short conversations Melanie had with her not doing much to distinguish her idea of her from Lucy's. They didn't know, for example, how long it had taken her to amass ownership of her part of the complex, nor what financial arrangements she had made with the other owners, who owned more than Miss Morrison and were less confident than she in the real estate market. Neither did they or Miss Morrison and the other owners know about all the people who had plans for the property. One company's idea was to buy it up and turn it into a barracks for its employees, the beginning of what might have become a company town. None of these schemes ever took form. Had Melanie began to wonder about these things and turned to Lucy for help, they would have found room to speculate, but lacking a real starting point, lacking something concrete to begin with, they couldn't have gotten very far. Their speculations would remain unfounded, so I suppose it was better for them to waste their time with more amusing things than their landlady. Something they could really turn their attention to was recalling when they had each had their first drink. Lucy started them off. She had had her first as early as childhood. Her parents had decided to satisfy her curiosity one evening, and then dropped the subject. That was good of them, Melanie had said, now unable to recall how long ago she had said it. I had to wait. Not that I can complain. I didn't have your curiosity. It was drinking hard, they agreed, or quickly, or alone, that made drunks. They resolved not to do any of that. Melanie said she was in less danger than in Lucy. She wasn't the one that opened the bottles. One of them, probably Lucy, in response to what Melanie had just said, wondered at how they'd ever landed on whatever it was they were talking about. Melanie really couldn't remember. The conversation stalled. Melanie began to look at her glass more than she drank from it. When this happened, Lucy assumed what Melanie could best describe as a matronly tone. Drink up, Lucy instructed. It won't be any good to you tomorrow. You won't like it any more than now. This she added in encouragement. And I can't put it back in the bottle, you know. Despite what Lucy's kind of encouragement might seem to say about her, neither of them made the other drink more than they could manage. The reason Lucy pressed her to drink, then, was exactly as she said. Slowly, Melanie would concede the point, and slower still would then follow her advice, which Lucy had tried, as she usually did, to give with humour so it could go down better. Melanie's return to drinking didn't revive the conversation. It gave her time to think and little else to do besides. She looked across the table at Lucy and saw, as she had often seen before, that Lucy was older, and older by enough to make a difference to at least one of them. She was shorter, too. It was this, among other aspects of her appearance, that made Melanie sometimes think of Lucy as a girl, in spite of her age. When they were just beginning to have these evenings of theirs, a time Melanie couldn't date, she felt her reasons still unexplained that this difference in age was important. She felt it was so clear to the both of them that it wasn't worth remarking on. It seemed nothing they might say could bring more attention to it than it already had. Soon their differences became greater to her than they had any right to be. She read into Lucy's face a softness, into her arms a thinness that, while present, wasn't there like she imagined it to be. She never shared this with Lucy, having talked of their first drinks, though, and now without something to say, she was tempted to admit it. Drinking made her need to say something. The silence weighed on her as she drank. She interrupted her drinking, holding her glass in the air, hesitating between staying silent and saying what she felt. Indecisive, her circumstances chose for her and made her stay silent. Keeping such temptations down was hard, but she forced herself to drink. Her glass almost empty, she came close to confessing, but some of her drink caught in her throat, forcing her thoughts off that course. When Lucy finished whacking her on the back and Melanie's spluttering was over, Melanie felt the temptation leave her. It was better to keep her petty jealousies private, to let them die and be forgotten, and not to risk them living on in someone else. Whatever made her recall those feelings, whether then while drinking at the living room table, or now while slowly pacing the living room, too lost in thought not to bump into the table, and what else was there to get in her way. That thing made her also realize how long it had been since she had last felt that distance between them or thought about it. She took this as a sign that she had conquered the feeling. Yet when she recalled the reason for her nervousness, she felt ashamed and felt she had been ridiculous. She must have been to think herself into such a state. Off in the distance a siren blared, outpacing the ambulance from which it came. The noise was faint, and though it grew slightly louder when the ambulance passed their street, it remained faint nevertheless, not a disturbance so much as something Melanie hadn't expected to hear or to wonder about, both the ambulance and the reason for its hurry. It was hard to tell without looking out the window when the rain stopped. It was hard to tell by ear, too, if the rain was letting up or taking a break before starting up again. Had she looked for Lucy's stash of wine, she might have found it after a time, but Lucy herself had come out of her room or had come back from wherever she had gone. Turning to face her, Melanie could see she had a new bottle in hand. "We're together now," she said as she opened it, "so it doesn't count." Lucy poured the glasses. Melanie took the glass Lucy gave her, not knowing if it was the end of the week, and trusting Lucy and her own feeling that it was. That was Roommates, written and read by Ballerscheff. Again, if you'd like to follow along as I read these stories, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.